Everyone to our first Judy Slee student seminar of the second semester in 2021. So this seminar is named in honour and memory of Dr. Judy Slee. Dr. Judy Slee was a cognitive psychologist and RSP for many years, a highly regarded teacher and also a very special mentor to both PhD students and ECRs as well. So today we have a great lineup of grad students, and Nourisha and Neve, another couple of our great grad students, will tell you more about that in a moment. Let me just go over the few housekeeping rules and etiquette of the RSP seminar series. So first of all, just a reminder that the seminar is being recorded and we'll make that available on the Psychology YouTube playlist. Upon entry into the webinar, you've all been muted, and we ask that you stay muted for the duration of the seminar. And at question time at the end of the seminar, you can raise your hand to ask a question and we will unmute you. And also you can add a question in the Q&A box at any time that you like. So I'll now hand over to Nourisha and Neve so they can introduce to you our fabulous speakers for today.
Hi everyone, my name's Neve. So we've got some great speakers presenting today, a mix of both straight research and clinical graduate students, which is really great. So we've got Aseel Sahib, Emma Dunstone and Kate Weston. And our first speaker for today is Aseel. And Aseel is a first year research PhD student at the RSP who graduated from honours at the ANU in 2020. Her primary supervisor is John Chen, along with panel members Professor Alison Callier, Dr. Diana Cardenas and Professor Richard O'Kearney and Professor Peter McEvoy. Her PhD investigates the role that emotion dysregulation plays in the relationship between intolerance of uncertainty and emotional symptoms. And take it away, Aseel.
Thank you. I will start screen sharing. And I'll time myself so I don't go over. Okay. So good afternoon, my name is Aseel Sahib and I'm a first year research PhD student. Today I'll be presenting on my PhD topic. My research aims to investigate the role that emotion regulation plays in the relationship between intolerance of uncertainty and emotional difficulties. This is the outline for today's presentation. Uncertainty. We experience it on a daily basis, from not knowing how good the coffee is at a new cafe to whether chemotherapy will treat one's cancer. And it is something that people generally dislike. Our need for certainty comes from our desire for control. If there is uncertainty, then there is a lack of control. There is research that finds that negative emotions, such as distress, are often experienced during uncertain situations. Based on this finding, an extreme aversion to uncertainty and intolerance of uncertainty has been studied and proposed to be a transdiagnostic factor across a number of psychological disorders, from generalized anxiety disorder to eating disorders. So what is intolerance of uncertainty? Intolerance refers to an incapacity to endure, while uncertainty refers to experiencing an unknown. Together, and in a simplified manner, intolerance of uncertainty refers to an incapacity to endure the unknown. To test this, scales tap into two components, perspective and inhibitory IU, a desire for predictability and uncertainty paralysis. To better understand IU and its effects, different models have been created to explain the cycle. I focus on three models in my research. The first is the intolerance of uncertainty model for generalized anxiety disorder. This model proposes that when individuals appraise an uncertain situation as catastrophic, they experience worry, anxiety, and perform safety behaviors that strengthen the perception of uncertainty and maintain the cycle. The second model is of a more transdiagnostic nature. It suggests that during an uncertain situation, the threat of the situation is estimated by an individual. This possible threat is compared to personal goals. If there is a mismatch between them, then the individual experiences emotional arousal, which causes them to activate safety behaviors, such as rumination and experiential avoidance. These behaviors are meant to help an individual cope or prevent uncertainty, but instead they are unable to experience discounting information that contradicts their perceptions. This leads to an increased estimation of threat and therefore a vicious cycle. The third model is of a more neurobiological nature. A behavioral inhibition system is activated when unknown stimuli are experienced. This system compares the stimuli with previously experienced or held predictions, goals, and memories. If there is a mismatch, then uncertainty occurs and fear and anxiety are experienced. Attempts to cope with the fear, anxiety, uncertainty, such as avoidance and reassurance seeking, are made. These relationships are moderated by dispositional fear of the unknown and dispositional intolerance of uncertainty. Across these three models, we see cognitive, behavioral, and emotional responses and difficulties for individuals with IU. I'm focusing my research on the emotional difficulties in individuals with IU, such as anxiety and depression, as both are found to be common in people with IU and interact with cognitive and behavioral responses to increase the experience of emotional difficulties, a recursive process. To understand IU, anxiety, and depression, we need to take a step back and focus on an underlying factor. Anxiety and depression are often associated with difficulties in regulating the occurrence, intensity, duration, and/or expression of an emotion. Difficulties in regulating emotions are known as emotion dysregulation. Emotion regulation is seen as the changes in the initial emotional response. This is generally an adaptive process, where the emotion we're experiencing may hinder our goals if expressed. For example, you have a goal to be employed. Expressing your anger at your boss would not help. Or the emotions are not appropriate for the situation, laughing when a child falls over. However, there can be instances when a person alters their emotional experience in a contextually maladaptive manner, such as continuous thinking about a situation that causes feelings of distress. This is seen as emotional dysregulation. This definition of emotional regulation comes from the process model of emotion regulation, which posits that emotions are experienced as a process: situation, attention, appraisal, and response. We can regulate our emotional experience during any of these stages. For example, avoiding work because of your boss is a situation selection strategy, while suppression of laughter when a child falls over is a response modulation strategy. Returning to IU, across the models, we can in fact observe emotion dysregulation. The dysregulation occurs in two forms. The first is that there is an appraisal impairment for individuals with IU. When an individual with IU is in an uncertain situation, they appraise it as threatening or catastrophic instead of exciting, and this leads to negative emotions. All three models propose some form of appraisal. We can see catastrophic misinterpretation of uncertainty in the first model, threat estimation in the second model, and misinterpretation of uncertain and the behavioral inhibition system in the third model. The second form of dysregulation is that IU models include other ER strategies which both maintains the IU cycle and provides additional evidence for emotion dysregulation. The first model includes safety behaviors such as situational avoidance, suppression, and reassurance seeking. The second model includes rumination and experiential avoidance, and the third model includes harm avoidance and reassurance seeking. These ER strategies do not effectively regulate the distress that has arisen from uncertain situations and the threat appraisal, and therefore are maladaptive. This in turn arguably leads to the development of emotional difficulties, anxiety, and depression. There are several studies that have tested the two arguments just presented. On the slide, you can see the details of two studies that have investigated threat appraisals in individuals with high IU. Both studies use cues to forewarn participants of either an incoming negative, neutral, or positive outcome. These cues indicated probabilities of what the outcomes would be. Both studies found that participants with greater IU appraised it as more threatening. In particular, the second study found that individuals with high IU use prefrontal cortical regions known to be involved in safety signaling and conscious threat appraisal more than individuals with low IU. There are a few studies that have investigated the combination of IU, ER strategies, and emotional difficulties. These studies mostly focused on rumination, or the ratio of suppression to reappraisal use, with higher ratios indicating more suppression use and therefore maladaptive ER strategy use. All studies found significant mediational results. Unfortunately, there are several limitations of the previously mentioned studies which challenge the conclusions made. The experimental studies investigating threat appraisal and IU are limited as they provided clear probabilities of the negative outcomes occurring, which is not an accurate portrayal of uncertainty. Probabilities are typically unknown. Most of the studies on the maladaptive ER strategy utilize cross-sectional design, which limits the conclusions that can be drawn. Moreover, these studies only investigated 3 ER strategies: rumination, suppression, and lack of reappraisal. ER strategies, IU, and emotional difficulties need to be systematically explored by not only focusing on maladaptive, but adaptive strategies. Understanding the impact of adaptive strategies will provide evidence towards protective factors for emotional difficulties in individuals with IU. To address these limitations, my PhD aims to systematically investigate emotional difficulties in people with high levels of intolerance of uncertainty from an emotion regulation perspective. This will be achieved through 4 studies. The first is a meta-analysis of all quantitative studies that have investigated IU and ER strategies. This will provide a clear understanding as to which strategies are used more frequently and those with high levels of IU. In turn, the second study will investigate these strategies over time in those with and without IU and their relationships with emotional difficulties, a longitudinal study. This will provide temporal evidence for how the use of these ER strategies leads to emotional difficulties. The third study will experimentally investigate whether an appraisal impairment in individuals with high IU exists, as previous studies are limited in the conclusions that can be drawn. While the last study will focus on altering the threat appraisals in those with IU, use in uncertain situations and following up on the effect that this has on emotional difficulties through an intervention. This will provide evidence and treatment that emotion dysregulation at the appraisal stage plays a role in uncertain situations, those with intolerance of uncertainty, and the development of emotional difficulties. Thank you for listening to my presentation. Any questions?
Thanks very much, Aseel. So now we're going to open it up to the floor to see if anyone has any questions. If you do have a question, you can, I think there should be a Q&A function, or you can raise your hand as well and we'll unmute you. So I'd welcome anyone to ask any questions for Aseel now, if you'd like to. Do you have any questions, Narisha?
I don't have a question.
Not at this point, but I did want to say that was a really great presentation, Aseel.
Thank you. And I guess thank you, Kate, as well.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I really admire how well thought out your entire PhD is, given that you're only in first year like me. I completely respect that, and that is really wonderful. So yeah, thank you for sharing that with us.
Thank you.
Well, if there's no questions, then I guess we can move on to Emma's presentation. Thank you very much, Aseel.
Thank you.
It was great. So Emma is a first-year clinical PhD student at the ANU under the supervision of a lieutenant. Her PhD aims to examine ways of improving student wellbeing, and in particular the relationship between extracurricular groups, social identification, and wellbeing outcomes. This will expand upon her honours research and identify practical ways of boosting identification. Emma, do you want to take it away?
Thanks, Narisha. I'll just work out the screen sharing. Thanks, and thanks for having me, guys. As Narisha said, I'm Emma, and I'm a first-year clinical PhD student working with Olivia Evans. My PhD topic is on ways of improving student wellbeing, specifically through their group memberships and social identification with all their sort of extracurricular groups. So as I'm early in my PhD, I don't have any studies sort of done and dusted to present to you, no results, but instead today I'll be looking at presenting some background information, going through my honours thesis and how it developed into study one of my PhD, and then going over my plan for the rest of my time. So why do we care? Why did I choose youth wellbeing particularly to examine and spend 3 years of my life on? So youth wellbeing has been declining over recent years. This is particularly the case since the start of the pandemic, where young Australians are reporting significantly more psychological distress than before the pandemic and greater decline in wellbeing comparative to other groups. Additionally, university students in particular, and particularly those in their first year of university, have been identified as a vulnerable population for poor mental health because this population is experiencing major life transition, a time of increased stress, isolation, and uncertainty. So given all this, I'm interested in investigating ways of bolstering and improving student wellbeing. And in particular, I'd like my PhD to identify practical ways of doing this so that my work may contribute to wellbeing in future years. So one area of research that might provide some insight into ways of achieving this is called the social cure, which is based in the social identity approach and refers to ways that social identification or group memberships can be protective against poor mental health. The social cure suggests that group memberships with particular characteristics provide us with psychological resources that buffer against poor mental health. According to this approach, the more group memberships you're a part of, the better your mental well-being and the more resources you have to rely on in times of distress. So there have been many studies that have supported this sort of more the merrier approach of group memberships on wellbeing. However, it's not enough just to be a part of the group. Social cure work would suggest that you also have to have internalized that group membership so that it becomes part of your sense of self. In other words, you need to identify with that group for it to contribute to your wellbeing. There's some research that has started to examine both the number and internalization of group memberships. These studies have often used importance of group memberships as a proxy for internalization and have generally reported that importance is more important for wellbeing than simply the number of groups a person belongs to. This work is limited, however, in that it has examined a small number of wellbeing outcomes and hasn't been applied comprehensively to youth. This is because the role of school identification, which is the psychological connection that the student has with the school, had not been considered in studies examining group memberships and youth wellbeing. This is an issue as school identification is a group membership that all students have in common and which has been found to have a direct effect on wellbeing in other contexts. So it seems important to include this variable in any youth wellbeing studies. So this is where my honours research comes in. For my honours project last year, working with Kate Reynolds and Deanna, we were able to look at longitudinal data from the ACT Educational Directorate to examine the relationship between the number and importance of student group memberships on a number of wellbeing outcomes, and also investigate the potential mediating role of school identification. What we found was that the number and importance of group memberships improved wellbeing only to the extent that they strengthened school identification. In other words, only groups that strengthened this superordinate identification contributed to wellbeing. But what's left unanswered here is what kinds of groups contribute to strengthening school identification. This brings me to study one of my PhD, which we are hoping to run later this semester. This study is designed to be a relatively small experimental study to sort of tie me over to next year, where we'll do a longitudinal study, but we couldn't start that until the new semester of university. So this will hopefully inform what we do next year. So study 1 is going to further explore this subgroup to superordinate group relationship that we found in the honours study. In conducting this research for the study, I found very little research examining ways of strengthening superordinate identities, such as school identification via the subgroups that students belong to, which just identifies that this is sort of a gap in the literature that seems significant, but that hasn't been looked at yet. So there is some research on the kinds of groups that are generally beneficial, and these are groups that are supportive and positive, that are compatible with your other group memberships. It also includes groups where you feel like you're a prototypical member, and groups where you feel a strong sense of belonging. So given the time and logistical restraints of my study, I chose to focus just on one of the variables I've just mentioned, in particular belonging, and to investigate how a sense of belonging with subgroups contributes to a superordinate identification and hopefully to wellbeing. I chose this variable because I want a practical element to my PhD in later studies, and belonging, unlike some of the other variables mentioned, can be more easily targeted in future programs or studies. And additionally, I'm conceptualizing belonging as one subcomponent that contributes to overall identification with the group, and therefore seems pertinent to include research such as this, which is examining ways of strengthening identification. So for my study, I'm looking at the salience manipulation for belonging to find out whether a strong sense of belonging contributes to a greater reported university identification and transient wellbeing. As belonging in this context is just one of many variables that contributes to a sense of identification, my model will account for students who feel like they don't belong anywhere, but who still identify as an ANU student. And by identifying these students and considering this in my statistical analysis, we'll hopefully be able to control for that. So there'll be two components to my study. The first is the belonging manipulation to investigate the relationship between subgroup and superordinate group effects. And second, I'll be collecting qualitative data on what it means to belong for university students. So there are 4 conditions to my study. I'll explain the first, and then it just repeats for second through to fourth. So for the first condition, students will be those who live in residential halls at the ANU, and they'll first complete a measure of positive affect, and then they will be told that, oh, I've pressed a button. They'll be told that students in their hall typically report a high sense of belonging, and we'll ask those students to give us a paragraph on a time when they felt they strongly belonged with their residential college. And then we'll see, we'll get them to answer a university identification measure, a positive affect measure, and ask them some questions on what it means to belong, which will be qualitative data we use to sort of get a better idea of what this means for university students. So then students in condition 2 will have the same process, but instead of being told that students typically report a strong sense of belonging, we'll tell them it's a low or weak sense of belonging and ask them to tell us about a time when they didn't feel they belonged in their residential halls. And then they'll do the same process as the previous group. And then we'll use students who don't live on campus or don't belong to a residential hall to tell us about their non-university based groups, just as a sort of control condition, so that we know that it's students who are thinking about their group memberships generally. That's not the reason for any increase in student identification, that it's actually subgroups of university that is significant. So we're hoping to find that students who are thinking about a strong sense of belonging with their residential hall will report higher identification with the uni and increased positive affect compared to students thinking about low sense of belonging or students thinking about groups not associated with the university. The study will provide insight into how students interpret and experience belonging, whether belonging contributes to superordinate identification in this context, and provide insight into how I might use belonging measures in my future PhD studies. So looking ahead, the goal next year is to run a longitudinal study, assessing a whole range of variables and their presence and contribution to university ID and student wellbeing. And then in year 3, using the results of that longitudinal study, we're hoping to test different programs for increasing group identification. This has not been developed very far yet, but it looks like there are both online and in-person options that we could adjust and adapt to test for this, and to hopefully find that we can manipulate some sort of group characteristic to improve student wellbeing at ANU. So just ask for any questions.
Great, we have some people raising their hands. Hopefully.
Hi, so I've got a question. So I was just wondering, from the point of view of someone less familiar with social psychology, what's the difference between belonging and identification? So I suppose my naive sense would be that identification with a group would be about a sense of belonging to the group, in which case it's sort of explaining belonging with belonging. So what's the difference between belonging and identification?
So that's a good question, which is sort of why we're including the qualitative data on what students perceive belonging to be. If they're answering it in terms of, oh, I really feel like this is part of my sense of self and I identify strongly with this group, then that gives us an idea that we can't really distinguish those two when we're asking students about their everyday experiences. But I'm visualizing or conceptualizing belonging more as one component that contributes to identification, and identification more as whether or not that membership contributes to your sense of self. So whether you associate yourself as being part of that group, whereas belonging is more, I feel I belong. Belonging as one component that contributes to that sort of sense of internalization.
Okay, thanks. And I forgot to say as well, great talk, really clearly presented.
And Aseel, do you also have a question?
Yeah, great job, Emma. My question, I guess, was, I know you want to do your study in this semester with the residential halls, and I was just wondering, how are you going to control for the fact that half of them are going into lockdown, then out of lockdown, then into lockdown, etc. All that.
Yeah, I think COVID for everyone is a bit of a bummer for studies. And I'm sort of working in the process now of considering how that's going to affect everything. At the time I was planning this, COVID, well, we weren't in lockdown, first of all. And in all honesty, I didn't think about lockdown when I was planning this. So it's definitely something I'm going to have to think about in the coming weeks before I do anything with this.
Sounds good, thank you.
And we also have a question from the chat. Someone's asked, what is it about belonging at a university college that should lead to ANU belonging / identification?
Sorry, you cut out. I didn't quite get that question.
It's in the chat. So it's, what is it about
belonging
at
the chat?
The college that should lead to ANU belonging or identification?
So the residential colleges, I'm imagining that as sort of, you've got this a superordinate identification of ANU, and then within that you've got all the different sort of sporting groups and residential hall groups and all these things. And I've chosen residential halls because you're sort of immersed much more than you are whether you're just doing like a sporting group or some sort of extracurricular within the university. So I'm hoping that because you're a residential college student within ANU or at the ANU, and you're sort of immersed in that every day, that will contribute to your superordinate identification of being an ANU student.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That was a really great presentation. Any questions for Emma? No? Okay, so our last presenter today will be Kate. So Kate is a clinical student who completed her honours at ANU in 2020 and is supervised by Tegan Crewis. Her research examines the impacts of gendered and sexual violence on mental health and identity. So.
Thank you. I will share my screen as well. If I can find my PowerPoint, here it is. All right, is that working for everyone? I'm just going to assume that it is. I'll put it in, there we go. Okay. So thank you, Narisha. As Narisha mentioned, I am a first year clinical PhD student. And just before I get into my talk today, I've put a content warning up on the first slide. My research is in sexual and gendered violence. So please, if this is not okay for you to listen to, please feel free not to listen to this part of the seminar. And yeah, just do what's right for you. So today I'm just going to try and give you a little bit of an overview of what I hope to investigate in my PhD. Given that I am a clinical student, Emma mentioned this before as well, there's not a lot of actual studies that have been completed and finalized, and I don't have pretty results for you at this stage, but what I'm going to do today is hopefully try and talk through what I'm hoping to achieve throughout the course of my PhD. So what I'm really interested in researching is how experiences of sexual and gendered violence impact mental health, and in particular impact identity. So I'll start by talking, how does this work? Okay. I'll start by just discussing where the research has been. So as I'm sure people are aware, there is a very strong association between experiencing gendered or sexual violence and a whole range of negative psychological and physical outcomes. So these include things like higher rates of mental illness, things like PTSD, depression, anxiety, low self-esteem, suicidality, basically a whole range of, it correlates very highly with a large range of psychiatric illnesses. And it also correlates very highly with a lot of physical illnesses. So autoimmune diseases, chronic diseases, sexual dysfunction, irritable bowel syndrome. It's not a good thing, I think, is the message that we're trying to get out. So we know that there are a whole range of these negative outcomes. We've also seen some research which suggests that post-traumatic growth is one outcome that occurs for some people who have had these experiences. And post-traumatic growth is a phenomenon where people experience changes in their psychological functioning that are positive. So things like enhanced appreciation for the meaning of life, a better appreciation of their values. And these are directly from their experience of trauma. So their trauma experience, in essence, encourages the development of these new values and meaning. Okay, so moving on. There's also a bit of a disparity in the literature about how we frame people who have had these experiences. So the two ways that these people are labelled are as victims or survivors. And interestingly, there was this really wonderful systematic review done in 2015, which found that researchers who looked at the outcomes, so things like I was talking about before, so correlations with mental illness diagnoses, and physical illness diagnoses that followed on from a result of this trauma. On the other hand, research that has looked at the impact of sexual violence on survivors has focused on both negative and positive outcomes. So this is not to say that experiencing sexual violence is a positive thing, just that this particular body of research has also measured things like post-traumatic growth in conjunction with measuring things like mental illness. So another really important point to make here is that there are different connotations that are associated with victims and with survivors. Overall, people perceive victims much more negatively than they perceive survivors. Victims are seen as more blamable, more fragile, less able to recover, more sort of permanently damaged by a trauma experience, whereas survivors are viewed more empathically. They may be viewed as less blamable, and they're often perceived as more empowered and having this sense of grown from a trauma experience. So there are real life impacts on how these individuals are perceived and how they are responded to by other people when they disclose an experience of sexual violence. Okay. So this brings me sort of roughly to what I'm interested in looking at. So we know that victims and survivors are perceived differently by society, and but what we don't really know is how these identities are internalized and then how they then come to inform mental health outcomes. So there's been some really wonderful work by Ola Muldoon, which indicates that trauma experiences, as we all know, they don't occur in a vacuum. Trauma experiences are more likely to happen to certain groups of people, and depending on the identities that they hold. So, for example, in the area of gendered violence, women, non-binary people, trans people, queer people, people of colour are all much more likely to experience sexual violence compared to other people who don't hold those identities. Trauma is also really fundamentally related to our identities in another way, and that is that our identities help us respond or to experience of trauma. So, for example, the types of identities that we hold are really crucial in the resources that we're able to draw on following an experience such as sexual violence. And Emma was talking about this a little bit before, how holding multiple identities or holding multiple group memberships is actually very protective. But conversely, there is a bit of a complicated relationship between things like gender identity and sexual violence, because sexual violence has the potential to really undermine something like someone's gender identity. So it's quite a tangled relationship, and it's not clear exactly what the role of identity is in informing mental health outcomes. And this is where I'd really like to look at, in particular, how victim and survivor identities influence things like PTSD, mental illness, and post-traumatic growth following these types of experiences. And this is especially important given that we know that victims and survivors are perceived by the public very differently and perceived as having different abilities to be able to recover, for want of a better word, from these experiences. So that kind of leads me into my little model here. I apologize because it's, I don't have any, since it's early days, I have a lot of hypotheses and a lot of literature that I'm trying to combine together, but what I don't have a lot of is results or conclusions for you. So I'll just talk through this model briefly. How am I going for time? Okay, we're all good. Okay, so essentially, what we know is that certain types of identities, so gender identity, LGBT status, ethnic status, all impact someone's likelihood of experiencing sexual violence. We also know that particular assault characteristics are linked to how other people then perceive a so-called victim or survivor. And what I mean by that is that sexual violence experiences that we perceive as more prototypical are, so these are ones where the perpetrator is is unknown to the person and where there is force or a weapon involved. These types of assault characteristics lead someone who has had this experience to be more believed by other people. So then when they disclose their experience, they're often more likely to be met positively. And by positively, I mean they're met with a lack of judgment, they're less likely to be blamed for having had the experience, and they're likely to be met with more empathy. We know that positive experiences with disclosure leads to much better mental health outcomes. But what we don't really know is what this survivor-victim role plays. So we don't know what types of, what sort of combination, I guess, of pre-assault identities and assault characteristics are going to lead to the development of a survivor identity, a victim identity, or both, or neither, and how that then in turn impacts mental health. We also don't know what the role of these identities is in how people choose to disclose their experience. So in the disclosure literature, people often take a variety of different trajectories, and I can't outline them all here, but some of the common ones are people will choose to either not disclose at all, they will disclose to one person and have a really bad experience and then never disclose again, or they may slowly disclose to multiple people over a period of time. And there are variations within that as well. So broadly, this is, I guess, what I'm trying to investigate this whole model over the course of my PhD. And to be honest, I don't know if this is more of a PhD task or a whole career task, given that there are so many links between all of these different things, but we just don't really know what these links are and what that really looks like soon. Okay, I may skip over this next little bit because I am running out of time. I would just like to finish up by touching on a population who has largely been left out of this movement that we're seeing and largely left out of the research. And that population is sex workers. I think it's really important to acknowledge that sex workers face a threat of sexual violence on a daily basis. They also face they face many more barriers than other people do in terms of stigma when seeking help for sexual violence experiences. And obviously legally and ethically, there are a whole bunch of complex sort of processes going on here which make it very difficult for sex workers to receive mental health support following these types of experiences. We've also found in the research, so I've linked Sprenkle et al. Down the bottom here, we see that sex workers who experience sexual assault are perceived as more blamable and are met with much less empathy compared to the general population. So basically there are a lot of barriers here. It's a heavily stigmatized population that faces this threat, probably more so than any other population. Sex workers are often also, the sex worker identity often is also intersected with many other marginalized identities. So sex workers are often women, they are often trans people or queer people or people of color or people who hold other stigmatized identities, which creates this very complex pattern and web of marginalized identities leading to a greater likelihood of experiencing trauma and a poorer likelihood of being able to draw on these social supports and resources following those experiences. So just to finish up, I think it's really important to acknowledge that sex workers do face this threat and they have been traditionally left out of this conversation, but I think we need to include them in this type of, well, I personally believe it's important to include them in this research because it is so relevant to them. And I think there's a lot that academia can do as a field to support sex workers and to break down the stigma that they face so that they can access the types of supports that they need. And that's about all from me. So thank you for listening to me ramble on. And yeah, I look forward to any questions you have.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Kate. That was really interesting and some really great work that you're getting into there. So great job today. So Stephanie, do you have a question or is that your hand still up from before? Oh, no. Oh, wait. Diana. Okay.
Hi, Kate.
Hi.
Thanks for your presentation. Very interesting. I was wondering if you came across the rejection identification model. Yeah, that just wanted to make sure that you didn't miss this one, because it's yeah, for those of you outside of social psychology, maybe Kate can give a brief summary of rejection identification model and why it would matter in this context.
Yeah, okay. So, oh gosh, I hope I do it justice now. So the rejection identification model was a model developed by Nyla Branscombe and colleagues, I believe. And essentially what it says is that, so all group memberships have different norms, and all social identities have different norms associated with them. Sometimes what happens when a set of norms are enforced or made salient is that people, I guess, they don't reject this identity, but they, and please, Diana, correct me if I'm explaining this incorrectly at all, because I am going off some reading that I did a few months ago. So I don't want to, you know, I don't want to give people the wrong impression, but people can essentially, if a set of norms are imposed on an identity and people don't agree with those norms, then it sort of causes them to. Do you want to take it over from here?
I'm so sorry to put you on the spot.
Thank you. No, please go.
Intention.
I don't want to give people the wrong idea, and I'm trying to pull out notes from the back of my brain.
No, and I'm sure you've read so many things in there. It's sometimes hard to put the right labels with the right research. Yeah, so basically the rejection identification model tries to explain that people who have had negative experiences like discrimination and such, they will experience less well-being, but at the same time, the experience of rejection and discrimination makes them experience more well-being. It can be protective if it increases identification with the group. So it's your model reminds me of this idea that by experiencing negative things associated with one's group, we can identify more with it and in turn experience more well-being.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting to think about how women in particular, I mean, I do acknowledge that other people other than women experience sexual violence, but I am focusing on women because it is predominantly a threat faced by women and non-binary people. But I am interested in the link between how an experience like this may devalue that identity of being a woman, and whether, if that is really important to someone, if that identity is really important to someone, and that gets devalued, or sort of, you know, there is some threat to this identity because of this experience, what sort of effects that will have, whether that will make people identify more strongly with women, because if they have, you know, if they have the knowledge and the sort of ideas that this happens to a lot of women and this is a very common experience for women, or if that will decrease their well-being because of the very same reasons, because this is a very pervasive issue. So it is an interesting link, and definitely something that I'm looking to explore.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. It sounds very interesting. I look forward to seeing the different potential mediators that will explain when it leads to more well-being and when it leads to less well-being.
Thanks, Diana.
Hi, Kate. I have a question. So, yeah, firstly on the topic, I definitely feel what you guys were just talking about. I definitely feel, even I notice when chatting with my girlfriends, we definitely almost bond over being women and the things that we experience in day-to-day life, but I won't get into that. Okay, so what I was kind of thinking was, firstly, has the research changed? And I don't know if you covered this or not, but has the research changed around that area since the Me Too movement? And I'm also almost thinking, even in Australian research since this year, for example, with like what we saw with Brittany Higgins and things like that, has anything come out more recently about cultural change in those areas to do with sexual assault survivors and victims?
I think we are seeing now that it is a really ripe time for this kind of research because of these cultural shifts. There is some stuff that is starting to come out. I think we saw a lot right around 2017 when Me Too was really sort of taking off. But again, a lot of it was all from this fairly one-sided perspective. So thinking about, you know, survivors and victims. I mean, this research has been going on for decades, but it's only really now that people are sort of seeing it through an intersectional lens. So seeing how different identities kind of inform the types of outcomes that people have. And I think prior to this, I mean, the victim and survivor research hasn't really been looked at through a social psychological lens at all. And I mean, there's been a lot of social research, social science research done, a lot of qualitative research, but no one's really investigated these links directly. And seeing a little bit of a shift and some more research coming out in recent years. We're not at the point yet where it's sort of inclusive of all people. And that's what I was really trying to touch on at the end there, is that we are, and not just sex workers, but we are leaving a lot of groups out of the conversation, which is, yeah, so it's sort of the privileged few who are getting talked about at the moment.
Right. Do you mean groups as in like LGBTIQ or queer people, or is that what you mean?
Yeah, and people of colour as well.
Yeah.
So, of course, I mean, we've all seen the news. We all know that, you know, it's wonderful that these, and I don't want to get too political here, but it's wonderful that people are coming out and being able to share their stories, but we're not seeing the millions of other stories that are going on for people who don't have the same sort of privileges or the same sort of positions in society. And I think a lot of that type of research is being missed.
Right. Yeah, definitely. And I was also just thinking, when I was looking at your model, and I don't know if you covered this again, because I've got the picture in my head, but can't really, it's not clear. How does, I feel like a lot of victims and survivors, what stops them from coming out and telling people their story is like that kind of sense of rejection or shame around like how it's going to be handled by society, I suppose. So how does like the role of shame, or, you know, just your personal sense of how it's going to be like heard or whatever, how does that fit into it? That's what I'm also thinking as well.
Yeah, and obviously shame is a huge one. I mean, there are so many barriers to disclosure, and shame is obviously one of them. Shame kind of fits in, I think of it as being part of the sort of, fits in with the sort of identities, group norms kind of space. So if, for example, some research that I was going to talk about, but I skipped over, which you told me then I should have probably talked about. So yeah, well, okay, so there has been some really interesting research done in Bosnia-Herzegovina where they looked at people who had experienced rape during the war, and they found that women who had experienced rape during the war largely appraised their situation in one of two ways. They either saw it as an attack on them as women or as an act of psychological warfare. So for people who appraised the act as one of warfare, they were able to construct a survivor identity because they saw their experience as being one on them as one that was sort of, I guess, devaluing their ethnic identity. And after the war finished, this allowed them to then, I guess, get together with everyone else who had these experiences, who had had other experiences in the war that were very traumatizing, but not necessarily rape, and And they were all sort of supporting each other because they had all had this collective trauma experience. On the other hand, women who saw this as a sort of gendered attack really struggled, because in part because the society is so traditional and it's very patriarchal, and therefore this experience devalued their identity as women. And this meant that they weren't able to talk about their experience. They weren't able to draw on those social supports because of this shame and this stigma. So it really comes back to, I guess, what are the norms, what are the salient norms, and what types of identities are strongest for someone, and what are the norms associated with those identities. And that then informs, I guess, the degree of shame to which someone may experience, and therefore how they then choose to disclose, if at all.
Yeah, no, that sounds really, well, I was going to say good, but I mean, it's good that it's being researched, you know, and I also feel like what impacts people's ability is knowing how it's going to be handled, like in the laws, like in law systems and things like that. So I suppose hopefully with changes coming into fruition as we progress, then more people will, you know, be able to speak up. But anyway, I think that wraps up for today. So I'm just gonna, thanks so much, Kate, again, and thanks for having that little discussion at the end. That was fun. Okay, so thanks for everyone for coming today. So we've got 3 presenters lined up for our next talk on the 29th of September at the same time. So Erin Parker, Imogen Clark, and Alyssa Robinson. So yeah, please come along again. It'll be really fun. And thank you so much to our presenters today for presenting. It was really great.